A very warm welcome to all of you who have come to this event to remember and celebrate Sumit Sarkar. We will not begin with the usual minute silence because Sumit would not have liked that kind of veneration. Instead, today we will listen to music that he loved and we will hear about him from friends, colleagues, and fellow scholars. Over the last few days, we have read and heard so many tributes to Sumit's scholarship, his political commitment, and his teaching. I myself was a student of Sumit's in Delhi University in the 1990s. A few days ago, we had a memorial for him at the Department of History, where faculty who had been his students reminisced about him. But what I found truly extraordinary was that the room was packed to the rafters with students who had never known him personally and had not been taught by him, but who encountered him through his work, through his reputation as someone who was deeply committed to teaching and to the classroom. In these difficult times, not least for the discipline of history and for the public university, Sumit's memory means a great deal to all of us. We're going to begin with Rabindra Sangeet. Rita Jyoti is going to sing for us. The song is Bipulo Torongo Re. This was a favorite of Sumit's that's been chosen by Tanika for today. The song evokes a vast wave of joy that sweeps through creation, dissolving past and future in its luminous tide. Sun, moon, and stars sway to its rhythm. Consciousness trembles awake. The world breaks into dance, and the heart finds its song.
জীবনে চঞ্চল একই আনন্দ তরঙ্গ বিপুল তরঙ্গ রে বিপুল তরঙ্গ রে তাই দুলিছে দিনকর চন্দ্র তারা চমকে কম্পিছে চেতনা ধারা দুলিছে দিনকর চন্দ্র তারা চমকে কম্পিছে চেতনা ধারা আকুল চঞ্চল নাচে সংসার আকুল চঞ্চল নাচে সংসার কুহরে হৃদয় বিহঙ্গ বিপুল তরঙ্গ রে বিপুল তরঙ্গ রে সব গগন উদ্বেলিয়া মগন করি অতীত অনাগত আলোকে উজ্জ্বল জীবনে চঞ্চল একই আনন্দ তরঙ্গ বিপুল তরঙ্গ রে বিপুল তরঙ্গ রে।
Sumit Sarkar, as the various tributes in the last 7 days have reminded us, was an inspiring teacher, a committed public intellectual, a fine polemicist, a wonderful stylist in his writing, a soft-spoken, gentle human being. But above all, he was one of the greatest practitioners of social history in the world. I think if we look at his work, there are certain constitutive ideas, certain ideas which frame all his writings. He was a Marxist, a self-proclaimed Marxist who remained Marxist till the end, at a time when Marxism was being renounced by other Marxists in the world. He was someone who is a Marxist, but a Marxist with an open mind. Someone who was always open to new traditions of thought, new insights that were being thrown up in the public sphere. He was always rethinking his ideas, his Marxism, through the prism of the new, absorbing what he saw as productive and insightful and rejecting all that he saw problematic. So critique was one of the important ideas, constitutive ideas that shaped his thinking and shaped his writing and shaped his public presence within the world. Opening up to the new, opening up to new traditions, then defining his distance from those traditions, developing a critique of those ideas. He opened up to subaltern studies, but wrote some of the sharpest critique of subaltern studies. He opened up to postmodernism, the linguistic turn, the discursive turn, postcolonialism, but he wrote some of the sharpest critique of postmodernism. He was a nationalist, but again, wrote some of the sharpest critique of nationalism. He would have liked to believe that he had transcended nationalism, but I think he never could transcend his original embeddedness within the nationalist frame. His nationalism was more complex and more nuanced than we see amongst the nationalist historians of our time. This just shows his ideas were never imprisoned within any rigid boundaries. He was constantly seeking to transcend those boundaries. This, after all, I think, was also Marx's method. Constantly opening up to new ideas, new political economy from Mill to Ricardo, all philosophies from Hegel to others, and then critiquing them, defining his distance and transcending them. And this, as Marx would call, is the process of opening up, subsuming and transcending. And this also was Sumit Sarkar's method, not just in the process of his writing, but as a citizen of the world. This went along with another framing idea that defined his writing. He celebrated heterogeneity. He was opposed to any monochromatic picture of anything. No movement was homogeneous. No ideology was monochromatic. There were always inner tensions, contradictions, different strands of thought, different traditions of thought within a social movement, just as much as there was a broad pattern, a coherence. So coherence was always ruptured, broken by these traditions, but they all come together in his writing into a coherence. So he's not celebrating either the fragment nor rejecting it, not celebrating a monochromatic whole or totality, but making it more complex and nuanced. This was his defining feature even in the first book that he wrote, that is the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. In that book, Sumit brings out in fascinating detail, with a wealth of evidence, all that was heroic and tragic, sublime and quixotic in those dramatic, eventful years of Bengal. We have no simple story of success and failure, no celebrity accounts of great deeds and noble figures, no linear unfolding of events which unfold to a climax. Instead of the monochromatic picture, a homogeneous narrative, what Sumit offers us are the many layered streams within the Swadeshi movement. All of them needed to be understood, all of them showing the inner contradictions and tensions within the movement. All of them had to be unpacked, and Sumit offers us that, even in the PhD thesis that he wrote, and which is rare to see a PhD thesis written with such nuance and complexity. In the 1970s, Sumit opens up to new strands of thinking of the time that were maturing at the time and circulating in the intellectual sphere. This is the time of his subaltern turn, the 70s, and this is the time of his engagement, deep engagement with E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson doesn't figure so much in his early book, the first book, Swadeshi Movement. But 70s is a time he's immersed in the writings of E.P. Thompson, and of course becomes a good personal friend by the late 70s. He's also immersed in the 70s in the micro-history of the time, Ginsberg and many others who wrote of the time. And this engagement transformed the way he visualized the book that he published in 1983, which is referred to as a textbook, but which I don't think is a textbook. It's a book written for the public, for the general reader, which became also a textbook. It was, I think it's a misnomer. Within this book, Modern India, we see how Sumit, as a Marxist, is grappling with these new ideas and synthesizing them in the book. He was always referred, as a Marxist, he was always sensitive to the popular movement. But in this book, the role of the subaltern classes, the role of the Dalits, the workers, the peasants and Dalits acquire a constitutive role. They define what nationalism was. They redefine the vision of nationalism. And that's not something he really actually elaborates in the first book. The different strands, different streams coalesced, creating a wider national movement that was plural, that was democratic, that was open-ended. Each strand had to be grasped, and the inner life of each had to be understood. The logic of each had to be respected. When I read it first, I was absolutely amazed by the richness of the book and the effortless ease with which he could weave dense details of regional movements and regional politics into this coherent whole, which was the national movement. So the nationalism is both a coherence as well as marked by these inner fractures and different streams, something which is there written as a comment, a quote from him in the poster itself. This was almost like a patchwork quilt, where the patches, in vibrant colors, where the patches are important. They have an independence. They retain their independence, but all these patches come together to form the quilt, which has a form, a social body, and which is something which can be seen as constituted by those patches. And I think this is something which he retains till the end. The capacity to go down, give you the detail, but bring the coherence back and argue for that coherence in a certain sense. Microhistory again is shaping his ideas in the 70s, and for me, one of the essays, all these essays come together in a book he published in the late 1980s, 87 I think. This essay is published in 87 in Subaltern Studies 6. And this is an essay on the Kalki avatar of Bikrampur, a village scandal in early 20th century Bengal, published in the 89 Subaltern Studies 6. In this fascinating essay, Sumit showed in wonderful detail how a dramatic incident enacted one night by a sadhu and his followers in Doihata village of Dhaka districts of Bengal tell us so much about the social world of that time, which we cannot know from conventional methods of history. He shows how seemingly unimportant events like this allow us an oblique entry into the social world, and how the myths and beliefs, the conditions of social life, the anxieties and tensions of the time, everything is revealed through this event, which is enacted in macabre detail by a sadhu and his followers in the household of a upper caste and Bengal. In the 1990s, from the mid-1990s, Sumit becomes a fellow of NMML, Nehru Memorial, and this is a time of intense intellectual engagement in a new way. He's now opening up to the discursive turn from the early 90s, discursive term, and the linguistic term, the postmodern turn, as well as the post-colonial turn. Now his ideas begin to gel together by the mid-90s when he's in Nehru Memorial, and he recognizes that and writes about it also. Once again, he negotiates these ideas, as I said. He absorbs what he thinks is good, and he critiques and writes 2 or 3 critiques of postmodernism at this time. And over the next 10 years. Once again, we see this productive, critical engagement, producing wonderful essays at the time, and which ultimately is published, brought together in 1998 as Writing Social History. And my personal favorite is Kaliyug, Chakri and Bhakti, Ramakrishna and His Time, published in 1998. This is an essay that shows how he was negotiating this the linguistic turn, the cultural turn, the textual turn, the narrative turn, and how he was creatively absorbing them, and at each moment defining his own critique as he wrote those histories. He explores in this essay in very nuanced way how figures like Ramakrishna had a wide audience. How does his thought, a specific version of bhakti, appeals to peasants, to bhadraloks, to middle classes? He has a wide audience. He unpacks the paradoxes and contradictions of Ramakrishna's thought, the ambiguities and the ambivalences, and he looks at his text, the Kathamrita, with the fine eye of someone who is unpacking by integrating the insights of the textual and the narrative turn. His speech, he argues, was dialogic, constantly developing through Ramakrishna's interaction with the audience. And he shows how his ideas that he spelled out in Kathamrita has inner ambiguities which allows him to connect to different audiences, the middle classes, the peasants, and the bhadraloks. He unpacks the text, looks at its contradictions, looks at its paradoxes, looks at its inner tensions, and then offers us a picture of Ramakrishna, who is interacting with the audience, very aware of the composition of that audience and orienting his arguments and ideas in interaction with the audience. So the whole celebration, the whole argument about audience and reception in narrative theory is integrated here. So the audience is discussed not only in terms of its social composition, but specifically how the audience reframes his ideas and forces him to change his ideas over a period of time. What is interesting are many other details within his arguments. He discusses how Ramakrishna often dressed like a woman, talked like a child, acted like a mad sadhu. And each of these acts had meaning. These had significance, and that significance had to be analyzed. And he offers us all that in this wonderful masterly essay on the Kaliyug. And finally, after using all the linguistic turn and the discussion term and their he brings it all together to talk of the social milieu of the time, the inner tensions, the frustrations of the middle classes, those who are doing chakri and the clerks of the time, and demonstrates the dialogic way in which the audience of this Ramakrishna's thought interacts with this, and that social milieu offers us an insight into why Ramakrishna's thought had resonance of the time. This is also a period where he's doing all this, that he is, as I said already, critiquing postmodernism. Sumit was a great synthesizer. And the qualities of his two great works for the people, Popular Moon, that is the first one, the Modern India, and 25 years later he publishes Modern Times. Both these works are wonderful examples of synthesis and wonderful examples of history written for the wider public. Very few historians can reach out in the way he could reach out through this rigorous works of intellectual synthesis. This was a different conjuncture when he published this book. It was a different moment in the history of our discipline, and it was a different moment in Sumit's intellectual journey. All through the 90s, as I said, Sumit had immersed himself in the new traditions of discursive thought, but beyond the linguistic discursive turns, etc., he was reading voraciously on environmental history, history of water, history of air, history of forests, history of pastures, all these things, and all these come together in the writing of this book, the masterly book, Modern Times. The structure of the book was also different from the first one. In the first one, his approach was chronological. And within the chronology, he talked of the regions. And in this one, instead of going chronologically, which he thought, I think, that fragmented the picture, he gives us the long term, the long synthesis over a long term. The first chapter draws upon the new studies of census, surveys, print culture, studies of power and knowledge, colonial discourse and law. New studies of environment, forests, pastures, commons, water shape the second and third chapter. And the new studies of leisure, visual histories, popular prints, photographs, calendar art become critical for the last chapter. So there's a huge panoramic history here, but all enriched through his constant engagement with the world of literature, historical, theoretical, conceptual literature of the time. I would like to end on a personal note. All those who have written have been Sumit's students, and Sumit, everyone has celebrated as a brilliant teacher. Aparna, Rahul, Shahana, many others have written wonderful tributes on Sumit. I would like to talk of him as a listener, not just somebody who talked, but who listened. Academics, I suggest, are interested in talking. They love their own voice, and very few really want to listen to what the other person has said. Sumit was that rare academic who was a great listener. I do not usually talk about my writings and projects in detail with academic colleagues for fear of burdening them with things they're not really interested in knowing and hearing. And you can see the interest flags after a while. But Sumit had a charming way of drawing you out, make you talk, elaborate your ideas at length. You could see his intense concentration as you talked, his twinkling, inquisitive eyes, his genuine desire to know, his mind constantly making mental notes, and then he would ask probing questions, seek clarifications, helping you to think through your ideas and helping you to formulate your ideas. I still remember that evening many years back when Aditya was small, still in school, when I landed up in Sumit and Tanika's flat in Delhi, and Sumit wanted me to talk about my book projects. Reticent at first, I started to chat. Food was ordered, and over dinner we continued to discuss for hours. I came back that night feeling good. I felt intellectually energized and affirmed. I felt that my ideas, the questions that I was posing, had worth. They were possibly more interesting and more important than I ever thought. That is what I've always felt when I've talked to Sumit. So his going is also a huge personal loss for me.
Well, in the recent past, I don't remember any academician, scholar, intellectual, having so many tributes written from students, from other scholars, from various fields, and really very moving and academic ones. I also wrote something about him, what he meant to me, and I do not want to repeat that here. I want to instead dwell on a way of thinking that Sumit gave us. Let me begin with something small. Between 1988 and 1990, Sumit supervised my MPhil on women in Premchand's stories. I went to him troubled. Premchand was the great progressive, yet story after story seemed to close on familiar conservative notes: the devoted mother, the chaste and dutiful wife. Sumit quietly redirected the question. He suggested that I look not simply at how a story ends, but at the tensions running through it, the plot, the tone, the wider context that the ending cannot fully absorb. A narrative conclusion is not necessarily the same as authorial intention, nor is there a straight line between intention and what readers make of a text. A few comments turned the thesis on the axis. That was Sumit as a supervisor. Never doctrinaire, but offering a way of re-entering a text you thought you already understood. Some years later, grappling with the confident sweep of Saidian discourse, I returned to Sumit's Orientalism Revisited. He showed how colonial authority did not merely impose itself upon Indian society. It often accommodated and reinforced existing patriarchies. A crack appeared in a powerful theoretical edifice, revealing a messier history between colonizer and colonized. Later, working on Brahmacharya, I returned to Kalyug, Chakri and Bhakti. That seems to be really a favorite of so many. Sumit's reconstruction of a new, underpaid, status-anxious clerical class, haunted by epidemics, rising prices, and a supposed lost golden age, along with fears of waning manliness, assertive lower castes, and disorderly women. It helped me see why semen preservation and disciplined celibacy could acquire such urgency in the service of an ailing nation, and how they were tied to larger histories of masculinity, caste, gender, work, and body. More recently, writing Hindi Hindu histories and caught between theoretical celebrations and dismissals of the vernacular, I turned to modern times. Again, Sumit refused both enhancement and enchantment and denunciation, recovering the unruly worlds of vernacular print, patronized by the colonial state, sometimes censored by it, often simply beyond its reach. 3 encounters, 3 moments, when Sumit's writing did what his supervision had done years earlier, made me see complexities I had perhaps smoothed away too quickly. People remember his books, of course, but again and again they return to the classroom, whose walls really seemed rather more porous than the university timetable allowed. Those of us who studied from him remember the almost poetic rhythm of his lectures, his extraordinary range, and his ability to make certainty give way to another question. We remember his work on nationalism, Swadeshi, popular movements in colonial India. But as my friends and colleagues Shahana and Aparna have written, he could move through early modern Europe with the same intellectual excitement. Witchcraft, woodcuts, and popular religion, Carlo Ginzburg, Natalie Zimmern Davis, Peter Burke. Political history opened into social history. National movement into local worlds. Leaders appeared alongside peasants, workers, and Adivasis. Caste and gender moved from the margins into the making of history itself. Literature, rumor, and popular belief enlarged the archive. But breadth for Sumit was never accumulation. It was connection. It is tempting at a moment like this to speak of Sumit in the vocabulary of monuments, a towering historian, a foundational figure. All of that is, of course, true. But a monument is fixed. Sumit's intellectual world never was. When modern India had already shaped a generation, he did not simply revise it 30 years later. He set it aside and wrote modern times, because historiography had changed. New archives had emerged, and his own understanding had shifted. Intellectual fidelity for Sumit was fidelity to history. Evidence could interrupt you, correct you, occasionally even embarrass you. Theory mattered, but he wore it lightly. It illuminated the archive. It did not substitute for it. He carried the same quiet conviction into his public life and politics, on Duta picket lines, beside striking workers, and in his unhesitating writing against communal violence at moments when silence would have been safer and easier. For Sumit, scholarship and citizenship were never separate rooms. And yet, there was nothing declamatory about him. Slight inbuilt, shy, soft-spoken, with those twinkling eyes and that wonderfully dry sense of humor. He could almost disappear into a room. He could guide without colonizing, correct without crushing. His students traveled in different places: universities, writing, journalism, public service. But something of Sumit's classroom traveled with them. We said our farewells to him on Independence Day. There was something resonant in that. A scholar who had spent his life asking what freedom actually meant. Not freedom declared from a rampart, but freedom argued over, appropriated, contested, and only ever partially realized. But there is another legacy, much harder to measure because it survives in habits of mind. The finest teacher remains with us in intimate ways, becoming part of one's intellectual conversation. And that conversation does not end simply because the person is no longer there. The mind understands, the heart is rather less disciplined. I think, for instance, what Sumit would have made of the recent Gen Z protests. Their almost carnivalesque air, the world turned upside down, authority mocked rather than feared, memes turned into political messages. I can see him standing slightly to one side, watching, immensely curious, wanting someone to translate for him every Hindi slogan, the cheekier the better. He would have enjoyed the wit, the refusal of deference, and the laughter. And then, with that familiar half smile, he would have asked the question none of us had thought to ask. More than 40 years after I first sat in Sumit's classroom, there is still one more question I want to take to him. One more conversation I wish I could have. Sumit has stopped speaking, but he has not stopped teaching. And I like to think that somewhere in that inner classroom, where our finest teachers continue to live, he is still standing slightly to one side, watching, smiling, and waiting for us to ask the next question.
I'd like to read some messages from friends who can't be here today. I'll begin with a message from Romila Thapar. I would like to convey my deepest sympathies to the family and to his close friends on the passing away of Sumit Sarkar. I have much admired his brilliance as a historian. It was always an intellectual treat to have a conversation with him. He was so good at giving us new thoughts of the most enquiring kind, which then led to further such thoughts in quiet moments. I also so admired the fact that he was firmly committed to upholding both his values and his teachings, expressed in his own writing and which he stood by so courageously. And it was all done in a quiet, unassuming way that was all the more impressive. So many of us will miss his not being around. This is a message, a tribute from Ravi Ahuja. I never had the privilege of attending Sumit Sarkar's classes, and still, as far as Indian history is concerned, he taught me more than any other historian. He impressed me, moreover, by embodying the rare combination of acumen and humaneness. He harnessed his towering intellectual abilities to give space to others and to never make them feel small. Like many in this room, I have fond memories of Sumit that will stay with me. But here I will keep them to myself and do not wish to indulge in anecdotes. Sumit will be terribly missed by his dearest and by many others, including myself. But he also leaves an inheritance that needs to be looked after, protected, and most importantly, recognized. Sumit represented the best traditions of Marxist historical analysis, the combination of the cold, ruthlessly analytical, and the hot, uncompromisingly emancipatory currents. This required the discipline of context, as Hobsbawm put it, the dialectical conceptualization of contradictory realities, the avoidance of simple binaries, the insistence on permanent re-examination of what seemed fully explored. Two traits of Sumit's writings have been more immediately discernible. Firstly, his unsurpassed ability to synthesize coherently the most diverse and contradictory tendencies of modern South Asian history, as exemplified by Modern India that was first published in 1983 and continues to be indispensable. Secondly, his deeply reflective, carefully weighing approach, which found expression in his magisterial essays. As a university teacher, I have observed that students found both of these traits challenging, but I have always thought that they needed to be exposed to this challenge to gain intellectual independence. There is also a third trait of Sumit's writings, I believe, that is less frequently recognized because it is less obvious. Sumit's deeply dialectical approach was unobtrusively presented. His theoretical sophistication did not require the stage thunder of the latter-day post-structuralists. It was quietly applied to the complexities of the historical material, and this often more implicit approach leaves much to discover. Only occasionally, for instance, in what is still the only sophisticated critique of the later subaltern studies, these theoretical underpinnings of his work became more visible. I end here somewhat abruptly because Sumit taught us not to occupy too much space. What I wanted to say was this: while Sumit will be sorely missed, I'm also confident that a young generation that presently searches for radical alternatives will turn to him as a teacher. And now David Hardiman. Sumit was a fine person whom I respected deeply for his great integrity in all matters. I met him for the first time in 1980 at his and Tanika's Delhi University accommodation in Civil Lines. I had sought him out after reading his book on the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, which had impressed me by its depth of scholarship and its grasp of the movement in all its complexity. It was by far the best study of Indian nationalism at the provincial level available at that time. He and Tanika were most welcoming, and I found that he knew a lot about my own work on the nationalist movement in Gujarat. There was a lot to talk about. That was the start of a long friendship. We were together in the Subaltern Studies project, and besides sharing a commitment to writing on the contribution of subordinate groups to the nationalist movement, we also took popular faith and beliefs in the divine very seriously. We see this in his chapter in volume 6 of Subaltern Studies on the Kalki avatar of Bikrampur and in his writings on Ramakrishna. At one stage, we were on track to edit a volume of the series on popular religion, but it never got off the ground as the project went in a different direction. I shared his misgivings about this development, though never broke decisively with the project as he did. He had a solid commitment to a humanist socialism and an admiration for the work of E.P. Thompson, with its rejection of a narrowly economistic Marxism. His analysis of Thompson's legacy in writing social history provides a defense of his beliefs and his historical writing, and a critical assessment that continues to resonate, at least with me. In particular, his defense of the discipline of history in the face of postmodernist critiques is something that I greatly value and feel strengthened by. This stance, I believe, has been vindicated by the rise of the populist right in many erstwhile liberal democracies, not least in India. We now understand how important it is to affirm the discipline of history in the face of propagandist versions of the past that justify the oppression of minorities and bolster an intolerant majoritarian nationalism. Although he had many health problems in recent years, Sumit retained his keen cosmopolitan intellect. His knowledge of many histories was prodigious, as I discovered when in recent years we visited or passed by historical sites in Warwickshire, such as Edge Hill. He knew immediately their significance in England's past. In all this, he was a pleasure to be with, to talk to, and I shall always treasure his memory. I am going to read out 3 more messages. The first is from Ekalavya Foundation. Ekalavya Foundation joins the family, friends, students and admirers of Professor Sumit Sarkar in paying our homage to him and celebrating his work. While his contributions to history writing and democratic movements is well known, his sustained engagement with school education interventions is less talked about. Sumit's association with Ekalavya goes back to the days when Ekalavya was not yet formed. Vinod Raina, a member of the founding group, was quite close to Sumit and had a number of conversations with him about the shape the proposed organization was to take, and especially the extension of its work to social science education. Sumit joined the Ekalavya family as a member of its governing board in 1986. He was also elected as the president of Ekalavya Foundation between 1989 and 1994. Of course, he kept complaining that he had no head for the audit reports which he had to sign as the president. Subbu, who joined the social science program in 1984, had worked with Sumit in the massive exercise undertaken by Delhi University History Department to revamp the BA Honours and MA syllabus in the early 1980s and learnt much about how to approach curriculum designing, especially in history. The position that Sumit took regarding the so-called periodization question was to have a lasting impact on conceptualizing school history syllabus. Sumit had argued that periodization cannot be seen as something happening at a definite point in time, but over several centuries. Secondly, periodization can be different in different spheres of human activity: production systems, polity, religion, literature, architecture, science, etc. This became one of the organizing principles of our history curriculum. Sumit took keen interest in the development of our social science books, always encouraging and giving perceptive suggestions. We were brought up on his Modern India, and it was one of the main inspirations for structuring the history of colonialism and the anti-colonial movements. The fact that instead of one comprehensive chapter on the national movement, we had separate chapters on the impact of colonialism on different segments of the population and their own unique ways of confronting and fighting colonialism. Sumit not only spent long hours discussing the chapters with us, but also came down to the schools to see how these were taught in the classrooms and how the children responded to the chapters. He would have his own deeply insightful observations of not just how the lesson was taught, but also the overall political contexts of schooling that he gleaned from these interactions. Subsequently, he prepared a detailed critical review of the chapters related to the colonial period. While being appreciative, he did not spare words when he found them wanting. This criticism was not only couched in gentle language, but was invariably accompanied by concrete suggestions of how the chapters could be improved. Sumit's involvement went much beyond the school programs. He was greatly interested in the Kabir Bhajan Mandalis, patronized mainly by the Dalit communities of Malwa. In fact, he encouraged his students like Shahana Bhattacharya to take up an ethno-historical study of these communities, going against the grain of the conventional history research. Even after he resigned from the governing body due to other preoccupations, he evinced active interest in the organization and its complex engagement with the state. His encouragement and sage advice will always be missed. We salute the memory of Professor Sumit Sarkar. This comes from C.N. Subramaniam, Vinita Balan, Tutul Biswas. I'm now going to read out a tribute from A.R. Venkatachalapati, and Chalapati's tribute has an interesting title. It's called Swadeshi Sarkar. My first encounter with Professor Sumit Sarkar was through the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. I never studied history formally until I went to JNU to do an MPhil PhD. But fascinated by V.O. Chidambaram Pillai, the great Swadeshi leader of South India, as a school student, I had begun to work independently on his biography. Once, at a leftist bookshop in Chennai, I espied a copy of the Swadeshi movement. Priced at Rs 16, the hefty volume was a steal. Even a freshman could afford it. I was too immature to understand the full import of the book and its methodological and theoretical breakthroughs. But I was floored by the range of sources that Sumit Babu had mustered for his study. Those were the golden age of publishing, when history monographs carried footnotes rather than dumping them in the back. I read every word at the bottom of the page, and Swadeshi movement became my Bible. How could one stop with Swadeshi movement? Over the years, I must have read every paper he wrote. After reading Modern India, I began to claim that I was his student. The test of a master historian is synthesis, and it cannot be gainsaid that it will remain the textbook of modern India for a long time to come. His own modern times cannot displace it. Despite the collections of his essays that Permanent Black has published over the years, my particular favorite is the slim A Critique of Colonial India and A Critique of Colonial India. In reviewing Writing Social History for the Chennai-based Indian Review of Books, I had expressed surprise at the lack of any mention of it. Sumit Babu acknowledged my review in a handwritten inland letter, which I still treasure. It was my particular fortune that Sumit Babu examined my doctoral thesis. Generously overlooking its patent flaws, he chose to underscore its strengths. For some time afterwards, I kept hearing stories about the Sarkars, Sumit and Tanika, exalting a very un-JNU-like thesis written by a Chennai student. Sumit Babu was the master of the long-form essay, and the flood of deeply felt obituaries has predictably and justly picked out some of his classic essays on Ram Mohan and the break with the past, the logic of Gandhian nationalism, Ramakrishna and the drudgery of the colonial middle class, and the scandal of Bikrampur. I would like to flag two underrated pieces. His 1984 social scientist response, The Communists and 1942, to Arun Shoury's Illustrated Weekly of India series on the great betrayal of Indian communists, stands on the same footing as E.P. Thompson's impassioned polemics. A similar moral passion informs his essay on P.C. Joshi. An early critic of the Indian variety of fascism, he did not hesitate to condemn the Nandigram firing. When writing my own book, Swadeshi's Steam, 40 years after first reading Swadeshi movement, I had an uncanny feeling that Sumit Babu was hovering behind my back, smirking at my awkward attempt to narrate the Swadeshi story in the South. The exacting standards of historical writing that he set are hard to match, but the endorsement of Professor Tanika Sarkar gave me some reassurance. It comforts me to know that Sumit Babu held Swadeshi's Steam in his hands. Never mind the sharp critique he made of the Bengal Renaissance, but in his passing, Sumit Babu royally walks into its pantheon. I'd like to read the message from Mrinalini Sinha. I was never formally your student, but like so many others have said since you have been gone, I too am your student. Long before I had the privilege of meeting you, and long after I began thinking of you as a friend, you provided me with the foundations on which I would build my intellectual frameworks. My bookshelves are filled with much-thumbed copies of your works, starting with Modern India, of course, that stood by me through my student days and has continued to be my go-to resource in my own teaching career. Of the many things you have taught me, and they are indeed very many, one is a strong and abiding love for the historian's craft. Despite an openness to different theoretical paradigms, you gave me my political calling as a student of history. In your writings, you showed us that history, like human beings, is too messy and unpredictable to unfold according to any predetermined schemas. Your corpus of work has thus always felt as a gift that keeps on giving, and it is a gift that will forever stay with me. But your words I will miss very dearly. You were such an exceedingly rare and exceptional academic superstar because you had none of the airs that come with that status. I am not sure they make them like you anymore. It is hard to believe how generous and curious you were to hear about other people's work. I still remember the keen interest you showed in my partner Clement's work on 17th and 18th century British literature. You and he quickly discovered a shared interest in the radical politics of the levelers and the diggers. It amazes me to think how kind and patient you were, even when some of what I shared with you must have sounded terribly crude and untidy. You still somehow made me feel energized and smarter after discussing my ideas with you. You had an unfailing knack of asking me just the question that would get me to what I had all along been trying to say but failing. I always came away from an evening with Tanika and you feeling both very heard and invigorated. It is a very rare quality you had to make those around you feel at ease. You have helped me construct my own intellectual map, Despite my debts to your works and to your words, yours was a wholly enabling influence. Dear teacher and friend, you have earned your rest. It is hard to let you go, but I won't begrudge the release you so richly deserve from human suffering. Yours has been a life well lived, and for me, it is a humbling privilege to have shared a part of this journey with you. It is now time to say a final goodbye. I'm going to read two more messages. The first is from Claude Markowitz. For me, Sumit was both a friend and an inspirational figure. When I got to know him through my wife Piali, I was still a raw beginner in the field of Indian history. On top of that, I came from Cambridge, which was then not the best recommendation vis-a-vis Indian leftist historians. He was an established figure and he could well have ignored me as a historian, but actually he was very encouraging, and at this stage his encouragements were important for me. I was not a certified Marxist but had leftist sympathies, and Sumit had a notion of Marxist historiography as a kind of broad church in which there was even a place for heretics. So we got along professionally as well as personally, and when I think of his kindness to me, I feel genuinely touched. When someone like him passes away, one tends to regret the missed opportunities of encounter, which are inevitable when one lives thousands of miles apart, though we did meet quite regularly in Paris, London, or Delhi. The more so as being with him was always fun and never in any way boring. He was not pompous or self-important, as academics sometimes tend to be, and did not take himself seriously. He had a marvelous sense of humor which was really his own. I would not be able to define it or locate it precisely. It was perhaps very Bengali, but I don't know enough about Bengali culture to affirm it. In any case, his company was always entertaining as well as enlightening, and one will miss him terribly. I could become emotional in evoking him, and therefore I prefer to stop here and to tell Tonika, Aditya and Anna how much I share their grief. The second message that I'm going to read out is a very special one. It's from Piali Markowitz, who grew up next to Sumit, and they were very, very close. He was first Sumit Kaka, and then one day he told me very sweetly, I think you can cut out the Kaka now. So he just became Sumit to me and my family. It is difficult to know where to begin when talking about Sumit and the Sarkars. Sometime in the mid-50s, my grandmother decided that part of the land on which our house stood on in Nagtala had to be sold. But she was adamant that she could only have Sushobhan as a neighbor because that was how it had been in Giridih. The two families were already close, but a much deeper bond was established when they built the house next door, a bond which continues to this day with Munia and Bochka. It is no exaggeration to say that my life changed completely the day the Sarkars moved in next door. There was no fence between the two houses, but just a small wooden red gate in the middle, so that the two families could visit each other without having to use the main road. Their house became my second home, and I was allowed to come and go as I pleased. It was a house full of warmth and joy. There were original Jamani Roys on the wall, and a large Satish Gujral was added to this collection later. Sunday morning addas were legendary, with Babli Didu's famous alur bora and coffee for everyone. What interested me most at the beginning was their complete collection of William by Richmal Crompton. They also had all the Agatha Christie's and a lot of P.G. Woodhouses. After I had gone through all the Williams, Kajal Pishi said, now you can start borrowing the Agatha Christie's. I was doubtful whether I wanted to read books with murders in them. So it was decided that Kajal Pishi would tell me some of the stories till I got over my fear of murders. And so began some of the most magical evenings of storytelling. We would sit on the takposh on the veranda with the entire Sarkar family in attendance, listening to Kajal Pishi with frequent interventions from Sumit filling in the details. My grandmother was still not wholly convinced that a fridge was a useful piece of household item, and it was difficult to get a telephone line those days in Calcutta. But they had a fridge and we had a telephone. Sumit, who was still in college, would very often receive telephone calls from some of his female classmates. I always took messages if he wasn't around and then bellow out from the front veranda over the noise of the main road. Ratna rang you up, and then there was also a call from Sunanda, you have to call them back, etc. This was a frequent occurrence and amused not only our respective families, but also the shopkeepers on the other side of the street. Ratna was, of course, Ratna Bagchi, but Sunanda remains a mystery. There are umpteen Sumit moments which I shall always remember with affection. Sumit bringing over a packet of 10 Cadbury chocolates to make up for my slab of chocolate left in their fridge which he had polished off. Sumit teaching me the partition of Poland with such clarity that history became interesting and not a seance of dictation delivered at bewildering speed. All of us coming back from the yearly youth festival and disagreeing agreeably about the play we had just seen. Sumit announcing his MA results on the steps of 19 Sharad Banerjee Road. Shumit's dismissal of some of the songs of the Lincoln Brigade, even though sung by Pete Seeger, and his clear preference for Ernst Busch singing Spanish Civil War songs in German. Shumit discussing the Musée Carnivale, which he loved. The list can go on and on. But my favorite memory is of the two of us scurrying down Rue Manger to see a second film after we had already seen one with only 10 minutes to spare, and Sumit chuckling and saying, "This is mad, I have never seen 2 films back to back. Are you sure we can do this?" His last trip to Paris was with Munya and Bochka a couple of years ago. I had given them the keys to our flat, and even though they tried to get into the wrong flat on the wrong floor, the trip was a success and he managed to visit some of the places he loved. It is rare to remain close to someone you have known since the age of 6, but that is indeed how it was. We last saw them in Leamington Square with Munya, Anna and Bochka. He was frail, but his wonderful sense of humor was intact. The afternoon was spent not only despairing over the state of the world, but also laughing and joking about happier times.
I want to remember Sumit Sarkar today above all as a teacher. His scholarship was remarkable in so many ways, and its legacy will survive physically and literally. Sumit the teacher was utterly immeasurable, and his impact incalculable. His classroom and the way he taught us and generations of students how to think and not what to think was a magic space that can be recovered only very, very partially through our recollections, fraying lecture notes perhaps. It is that immeasurable and unarchivable Sumit that I want to recall a bit. Through his extraordinary textbook, Modern India, Sumit had started teaching us in our final year of BA, long before we met him. Then in the MA, he taught us this paper that Charu's talked about, on European history and culture that got us really hooked onto history, the kind of nuanced and layered history that he wrote and introduced to us to in class. We knew Italian words from Shumit's lectures and our long discussions on Italian humanism and art. Our interest in looking at detail, understanding various perspectives, tracing complex histories, and being attentive also to histories of the marginalized grew in these classes. We learnt of Leonardo da Vinci referring to himself as uomo senza lettere, unlettered man. We went on to discover the brilliant scholarship of the likes of Carlo Ginzburg, Burke, Scribner, Natalie Davis, Lyndall Roper, Mary Weisner, and so many others. He made us read Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose to start with. That was the beginning of the course. When I went to Italy decades later, I remembered the details like Masaccio's early 15th century depiction of the poor in his painting St. Peter healing the sick with his shadow, in the Brancacci Chapel frescoes in Santa Maria della Carmine in Florence, because we had discussed this and other paintings of the Renaissance at length in class. We had read about peasant protests in Germany before the 16th century Peasants' War. Hans Bohm, the drummer of Niklashausen, the poor Conrads who supposedly led secret peasant leagues in the years before the Peasants' War. Shumit's classes made our minds buzz with ideas, even though his style of lecturing was always measured and undramatic. I recall how his sense of humor and irreverence often came through in the classroom while discussing, for instance, the scatological woodcuts of the Protestant Reformation that Robert Scribner had written about, allowing our class to also crack up with laughter and be grateful that he wasn't under the jurisdiction of the 16th century Pope. Through all these discussions, we engaged with material histories, class, religion, and the ways in which environment shaped consciousness and society. Many of these themes remain the focus of our MA final paper on social history in India, which Sumit taught. He introduced us to readings on popular movements, class, religion, and community. We read widely. We read Genovese on slavery, religion, and resistance, among others, to engage with and understand all these issues. I vividly remember Sumit's class on 7th December 1992, the day after the demolition of the Babri Masjid. We were all somewhat stunned. That day, Sumit cited Raymond Williams, spoke of the dangers of narrow economic determinism, of how material conditions are not simply economic conditions, and how the interpenetration of multiple identities of caste, class, gender, religious community need to be closely studied. That same evening, a city-based group called the People's Movement for Secularism came together, and a similar group forum came up in DU, and Sumit was actively involved in both. When I think of Sumit, I remember seeing him walking a kilometer or more every morning to the arts faculty, wearing his favorite teal blue sweater, somewhat lost in his thoughts, oblivious to the chaos of Delhi University's Chhatra Marg around him, or to a student hollering, "Good morning, sir," to him from a rickshaw across the road. I think he managed to get a lot of exercise on that, between that walk to and fro from the house, and the vast amount he walked while pacing up and down in the classroom, talking in his inevitable, even style, often barely looking at his copious notes. And yet, for all his shyness and quietness, for undergraduate and postgraduate students, he was a rock star. Ravikant, who was his student, recalled how once when Sumit visited his college, students crowded around him just to touch him, to be close to someone great. We can only imagine how Sumit, always dismissive of any attempt to venerate him, might have reacted to this. To be honest, though, he had immense empathy and understanding of students. As a supervisor and teacher, he was extraordinary. I still have his comments on my papers and chapters written in painstaking longhand. His suggestions, for instance, not to make generalizations based on one source where I was tending to, or to push the argument and look for further evidence elsewhere. Through these, he taught me a bit more about the historian's craft, which he knew so very well. I tested his patience and empathy when I would land up with my MPhil chapters after the deadline at their house on my Bajaj scooter, sometimes with a bloody arm or foot after one of the many minor accidents which I used to have while I was learning to drive. I was oblivious of the sight I presented, and though alarmed, he did not lose his composure. Sumit and Tanika helped me put body and soul and MPhil dissertation together. My driving skills improved, but they didn't want to test them after that. Many years later, after Sumit's terrible accident, in the early days when he was still quite unwell and finding simple tasks like buttoning his shirt difficult, his mind was razor sharp as ever. I was once there and struggling to find a reference to Peter Mayer's article on the Jajmani system, and was talking about this. And Sumit, lying in bed with his eyes closed, said, "Modern Asian Studies, 1993. He did recover somewhat in the years after that, and I'm grateful that he also read some of my PhD drafts and continued to work and publish so much. This last year has been hard for him, for Tanika, for Bochka and Anna. My heart really goes out to them because they, above all, must feel most what we are all feeling. This void that Sumit leaves behind in times that are bleak in so many, many ways in our university, in the country and elsewhere. We could feel sorrowful and be tempted to quote Macbeth, which is about the only Shakespeare I know, and I know was Sumit's favorite. So I'll just quote it anyway. We might be tempted to do that. This is depressing, though. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Alternatively, we could also be hopeful, as Sumit certainly was, about things getting better someday. While grieving his passing deeply, we should remember what he stood for, who he was, and instead sing the song, perhaps, that we did when we bid farewell to him on 15th August 2026, a song that he would have approved of, "We Shall Overcome."
Can I ask P.K. Datta to come on stage and say a few words? Thank you so much, Anna.
Afternoon. Yeah, I'll speak on as a teacher, basically. One of my most cherished stories of Sumit is that he tended to look very glum and actually grim if somebody praised him. But his face would light up with sheer happiness if you criticized him. Sumit was one of those few influential thinkers I know who was constantly open to criticism and self-criticism. And he was not unhappy to go public on himself. One of the key things that Sumit emphasized in his own class was that historiography was a process. The writing of history itself was a process, and thinking about history was a process. Hence, it was open to change. And Sumit's self-criticism was essentially a way of affirming the process of doing history itself. The process, in other words, was more important than the positions he took at any given point in time. This, of course, did not mean that anything went. For a mild person, Sumit could be extremely sharp, even cutting. But if he regarded any argument as serious, he would do justice to it. I recall his lectures that carefully parsed each argument with which he did not agree with before putting his own stands and objections to it. Sumit taught us to be careful thinkers in class. There were two kinds of teachers whose notes I copied very faithfully. One was a kind who was very serious, but whose ideas I thought I would better understand if I actually read it later. So I would write down very copiously and everything that was being written, with the thing that, I'll postpone the understanding. The remarkable feature of Sumit for me was that I was almost magnetically attracted to writing down each word, despite the fact that I understood everything that he said at the same time with perfect lucidity. Equally remarkable was the way that when I went back before the exams, mugging for the exams and so on, and I glanced at those notes, I could recall everything very easily. Just had to glance over it. And what was even more important for me was that I not only internalized it, but I could also pose questions to it, which I then, of course, also expressed in my examinations, and as the experience of so many others in my class when we did pose a serious objection, he gave us very generous marks. So, he was really very open constantly to that kind of a serious engagement, critical engagement with him. There were 4, when I think back, crucial issues, crucial spaces, let me put it that way, that defined Sumit as a teacher for me. Besides the classroom that was absolutely central to his universe, there were the depositories, the libraries and archives. I remember Sumit entering the swinging door of Teen Murti, then called Teen Murti, after signing the register, parking his pen and paper on one of those beautiful wooden tables, and then rushing off to the journal section. Sumit was constantly updating himself on the latest research, on multiple subjects, without, and that's so important for many of us and something that I learned, without narrowing his focus to what he was working at that particular moment. He was constantly open. He had an insatiable, Catholic curiosity that he communicated to all of us, even as we went on to interrupt his readings by fixing appointments during lunch hour. But Sumit was also very practical. I recall I'd become pretty lackadaisical at one point in my time in attending the reading room. I don't know whether it was the National Library in Calcutta or the National Archives in Delhi. And he noted it. It must have struck him, but he never mentioned it. He was very far from being a disciplinarian. So one day, like any other ordinary student, I complained to him about the inattention of the attendants. Sumit was brusque, dismissive. He simply observed that if a person came regularly to the archives, then the attendant would take greater care attending to his needs. The third space, there's the classroom, the library, the archives, was his home, which I was fortunate to visit. His home, in a sense, existed in a continuum with the library. I mean, you can see the number of books, the photograph over here. But a very voluble library, where I was exposed to the excitement of different debates on new insights and formulations by mainly historians, but not confined to them, as well as, very importantly, passionate debates on the present, and then rewarded by some sumptuous food, which of course he wasn't quite responsible for, but nevertheless it came. And it was like so incredibly hospitable, and of course Tonika and Aditya and others were always there. If one was lucky, you could also meet noted and even legendary academics, and what was nice was you could meet them without the halo of their stardom. And Sumit had a way of creating a sense of togetherness, of academic togetherness without, the academic hierarchies or the stardoms that often attends academia. The fourth space were the spaces of movement and protest. Sumit not only hit the streets on countless occasions, on countless kinds of issues, hit the streets like any other new young college recruit or student. But the street, I would like to say, is not divorced from the other spaces that I've mentioned. I recall his unflagging enthusiasm in participating in DUTA movements, the trade union movements of the teachers, which was a rare thing for a professor who had no real personal stakes in their demands. Equally remarkable was the way he addressed college staff rooms to mobilize, speaking in his perfectly modulated pitch, patient with both the teachers who raised doubts or who simply opposed point blank the Duta leadership. He he stayed focused on the issues, just as if he were in the classroom. And like us, the students, no college teacher felt patronized. There were so many other moments. Intense discussions on the Mandal issue, which we were initially a little unclear about, and then Sumit gets this incredible, engages in this incredible debate with another student and actually clarifies his own understanding and clarifies it certainly for me. All the classrooms and auditoriums in schools, when together with other academics, he went to demystify ideas about Muslim demography or about Gandhi's role. There has been a remarkable outpouring of writings on Sumit, as we've all seen. Remarkable and exceptional, I suspect. I think the common theme of these articles has been, despite his, besides his teaching, I mean, that has been critical in his classroom and so on, but I think the way they all intersect is in the democratic qualities of the man. For Sumit, democracy involved all its principles, rights, obligations, democracy as a process, and so on and so forth. But what was truly remarkable was that Sumit performed democracy. He was democratic, as it were, by disposition. It doesn't appear to me to have been the product of any ethical decision either. It was really a quality of the way he related to others. Simple, direct, without the transactions of power. And it was this quality that permeated all the spaces that he inhabited and which he generated as if it were a moving habitus that surrounded us, that enclosed us, all of us who were in its proximity. It was this that was the most valuable aspiration that he communicated to me as a teacher, and I think, and I suspect, to all of us who came in whatever capacity in close contact or in any contact with him. But I think the best thing about this was that Sumit himself wasn't aware of all that he contributed to our making.
I'd barely known Sumit before 1989, but the tumultuous events of that year brought many of us together. The brazen murder of Safdar Hashmi, the Tiananmen Square killings, and soon afterwards the fall of the Soviet Union spawned street protests, marches, public meetings, conferences, workshops, and reading groups. And this brought many of us close to one another. We met virtually every week, if not daily, at a Sehmat event or a workshop on socialism or at anti-communal forums such as Sampradayikta Virodi Andolan and later the People's Movement for Secularism. We also went to different schools of Delhi, interacting with teenagers, asking questions and answering their questions. We spoke at public halls, not only in Delhi, but also in other parts of the country, in Hyderabad, Bhopal, among others. And as I said, we also held reading sessions at each other's home. Those who were part of all of these, and some of us invariably were at that time, came naturally close. One particular event is worth remembering, and Sumit, of course, was part of that. We had printed leaflets against communalism, and we went to different areas of Delhi to distribute them. As part of this endeavor, we came to Nehru Place. There was Tani and I, and of course Sumit and Tonika, Anuradha and Kamal Chinoy, Gautam Navlakha, Nivedita Menon, Aditya Nigam, PK, among others. Not a very large number, about 12, 13 of us. But suddenly we saw ourselves surrounded by about 50 people aggressively raising slogans against us. Soon the crowd swelled, not only in the chalk, but in all the balconies around it, shouting down at us and in unison, Jai Shri Ram. The noise was deafening and the situation quite frightening, very intimidating. Soon the police arrived and whisked us away. We thought we were being arrested, but we were put in jeeps and fortunately sometime later just let off. We were taken away from that crowd. A very intimidating experience it was. We also organized and participated in workshops and seminars. One of them is particularly memorable. That is the Study Week on Secularism, organized at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. This was an unforgettable event because of an astonishing experience. In a session on partition violence, this was I think in 1997, Urvashi Batalia presented what was to later become a chapter in a book. One of the participants, Professor Satish Sabharwal, listened to her, and in the middle of his response to her, recalling what he felt was his own complicity in the slaughter of innocents, complicity not by action, not in action, but by silence, he broke down. And as he wept, all of us, one by one, began to choke and then sob inconsolably. There were about 20 of us. Sumit howled too. It was a massive cathartic moment, as if we were all letting go of our guilt and having personally allowed this catastrophe. These kind of experiences were bound to turn political camaraderie and intellectual companionship, at least for some of us, into lifelong friendship. Sumit Sarkar was clearly not only a scholar who spent his time in the archive among books, in libraries and seminars. He believed ideas belonged to the public world. They must enter civic life, enrich democratic debate, and help societies reflect upon themselves. Sumit was an exemplary citizen. I think a lot of you have talked about it. Who knew that there are times when we have to fight not just with a pen, but with every morally permissible resource, and not just in print media or in seminar rooms, but on the street. Over the years, his position evolved, his understanding deepened, his arguments became richer and more nuanced. But while his views changed, his values remained constant. He always stood for reason, for justice, for human dignity, for equality, and for freedom. He believed that intellectual life carried with it a moral responsibility, a responsibility to speak honestly, to think carefully, to resist prejudice and tolerance. He helped us understand our past, interrogate our present, and imagine a better future for everyone. For him, secularism was a given, and it meant the cultivation of a society, simply speaking, in which people with different faiths, identities, and convictions could live together in mutual dignity. Sumit also understood, PK mentioned that, Sumit also understood that democracy is sustained not only by institutions, but by habits of mind, openness, civility, self-restraint, and a willingness to listen. And that socialism was at root about having a high quality of sociability, about having non-instrumental social relationships, where people viewed one another as having intrinsic worth. Sumit possessed a learning that, as is widely known, was unusually deep and wide. He was a master in his own field, modern Indian history and modern history in general, and inspired admiration across the world. But he never confined himself within its boundaries, again something that has been mentioned. But one could begin a conversation with him on a specialized question of history and find oneself an hour later speaking of poetry, music, painting, ethics, religion, popular culture, constitutionalism, or the dilemmas of public life. And yet his erudition was never a wall separating him from others, but a bridge. He never used knowledge to intimidate, but always to illuminate, and not from a pedestal, but as a co-participant. But of course, the most distinctive and remarkable feature of Sumit was his intellectual humility. It's very easy for scholars to begin with humility, and as they age, as they grow in stature, to become not only intellectually aloof but arrogant. Not Sumit. He had all the intellectual virtues that one expects from a profound thinker. A deep and abiding desire for knowledge, accompanied by a disposition not of self-doubt, but of a very healthy epistemic uncertainty, without which no gain in knowledge is possible. He was always very thorough and always open to self-criticism. And to admit that one has been wrong in the past requires moral courage, which he had in plenty. Intellectual arrogant people, and this has also been mentioned, intellectually arrogant people are poor listeners, and they rarely take contrary views seriously. They also become, over time, impervious to evidence. Sumit was a perfect listener and steadfastly went where evidence and argument took him, even if on the way it unsettled his own views, and equally importantly, the views of his close intellectual companions. Holding on and speaking firmly about your own convictions, despite the uncertainties surrounding them, is an art that Sumit had learned gently, quietly over time. He never prematurely sought closure of ambiguity. He'd rather live with it than move into a false zone of comfort. For Sumit, humility was not merely an attitude or a mood, but a structural feature of how good thinking proceeds. If it demanded the deliberate deferral of certainty, he would happily do it. So Sumit, as I said, had no trace of intellectual vanity. Fame had come to him, and deservedly so. His writings were read internationally, widely. His voice mattered in public debates. His scholarship commanded respect. But these achievements sat upon him lightly. There was never any display, never any posturing, ever. His erudition, I think this has already been mentioned, never intimidated people, never crushed them, it uplifted them. I cannot end my tribute without a short anecdote about Sumit and Tani. Tani has this very unusual and very special relationship with all our friends. So on one of the many visits to our home, Sumit took his shoes and socks off, came gently and sat down. Tonika, of course, was also there. Tani joined us 10 minutes later, and when she entered, her eyes fell on Sumit's toenails that she immediately felt, and that's a personal feeling, were in an appalling condition. Tani is a sharp observer and quite fussy about aesthetic, although it hasn't made any impact on me. Within minutes, from nowhere, a pedicurist appeared. Sumit did not quite know what force of nature had hit him. Job done, we had lunch or dinner, and when they reached back home, Tonika, who was mighty pleased with this task that Tani had undertaken, called us to say that Sumit was very pleased. My feet are transformed, he explained in wonder. Sumit's simplicity, as you know, was very disarming. Thanks, Sumit, for your kindness, your gentleness, your erudition, and your friendship. You will live with us forever.
I'll probably fall. Like many of us here, I too have written about Sumit very recently. Like many of my friends who've spoken before me, I wasn't a formal student of Sumit's. I was a student by osmosis, just by being around him, reading him, practically everything that he has written over a long period of time, rereading some pieces, engaging with it, teaching some of all of this. So I suppose being a student has different kinds of meanings and being a teacher has different kinds of meanings. But I must say that I didn't think of Sumit as a teacherly figure at all. I thought of him as a brilliant mind, very sharp, amazing scope of knowledge, a kind of recall until very recently, which was staggering. You might have read those same things, but he would recall all kinds of detail from goodness knows where and from all kinds of sort of historical, non-historical, literary and other kinds of things that he had been reading. And as Shahana mentioned, he could be lying there with his eyes closed and mention a reference from goodness knows when. So this was something that I think for most of us made a huge difference, because much of all of what I was reading in the 1980s, I met him in the early 1980s when I was an undergraduate student. In fact, the very first time I saw Sumit was when he and Manoranjan Mohanty were speaking at Miranda House. I was a first year undergraduate, and I don't know what they were speaking about. It wasn't an academic occasion, it was political. I was completely blown away. I thought, what a wonderful thing to be an undergraduate, to be listening to these kinds of things. So it was a great moment. And after that, when Modern India came out, and that is also the time when the first volume of Subaltern Studies and Ranjit Guha's Elementary Aspects came out, and there was this sort of, it was like electrifying that time. And we learned the phrase history from below. And whether we did it or not, we understood that history could be thought of very, very differently. I don't want to speak about, his extraordinary corpus of writing, which ranges across so many different kinds of themes, partly because I've written about it, partly because others have spoken so eloquently about it. What I want to do is speak with a few images in my mind, non-photographic images. I have pictures of Sumit and Tonika from a very long time back, but these are non-photographic images that live on in my mind, and two poems. The first that I want to share here is from early 1995 in the Center for Development Studies. I was there at that time. And Sumit and Tonika and Bhojka had come, and Uday Kumar Udayan, who is known to many of you here, and I had decided that we would twist Sumit's arm into speaking about time. And he readily agreed, which was also another characteristic quality of Sumit's, which is he had no nakras. It wasn't like gala kharab hai, I cannot speak, I have many other, things that I need to be doing at this time. He agreed. I remember on the morning of his talk, going to the CDS guest house and seeing him sitting and writing out his lecture, the talk that he was going to do, longhand. then in the afternoon, he came and without looking at his notes or his lecture, it was like a declamation. He stood there like an orator, like a historian, rock star orator, speaking mellifluously, speaking about time, and we were spellbound. Now, many of us, particularly people of my generation and older, would have read a very early iteration of some of this in the early 1990s in the Chakri essay, and many have spoken about it. But Sumit returned time and again to the question of time. It was something that interested him in all manners of ways, not only to do with the drudgery of the everyday, but also in terms of what kinds of disruptions different kinds of temporal regimes could do to one's life and to history itself and history writing. The second is a very different kind of memory that I have. I was teaching in Lady Shri Ram College at that time, and I jumped onto a mudrika, and suddenly I turned and I saw Sumit in the same mudrika. He must have been going from North Campus to South Campus to teach. He was hanging on to, one of those, things that you could hang on to, or, whatever that's called. Yeah, that thing. But what was really striking was that he was wearing his rubber chappals. He had that brown leather bag, which many of us remember with that flap. And here was probably the most renowned historian around at that time, the person we all knew and looked up to, hanging on to this thing, going off to teach. And, it's an image that lives on in my mind because it's a reminder of who he was and how hard it is to be somebody like that. The third is an image from the VP House lawns when the early PMS meetings used to take place there and so on, the People's Movement for Secularism. And I have a very vivid memory of Sumit and Tonika and PK and many others sitting on the grass, Sumit sitting quite quietly, listening to what was being discussed, engaging from time to time. And when I look back at that, it strikes me that for somebody who probably knew much more than most of us did, not only on the history of the growth of what later became termed as Hindutva, and he has very interesting things to say about the term itself in his essays, but also about histories of fascism. He didn't feel the need to sort of jump in, correct us, make us, do some kind of course alteration or anything like that. It's that image of him sitting, as all the speakers prior to me have said, in this completely easy, egalitarian, non-hierarchical, democratic way, engaging in a democratic political discussion. Right? And the memory of Sumit engaging in politics is something that I value very much. The fourth is, PK spoke about the time when he used to come to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and he used to come. He used to be there not only when he was a fellow, but as many of us know, he used to go there after classes. He used to rush to Teen Murti. Tonika also has done that, and it is truly exemplary that people who have had such busy lives as teachers and scholars and writers have taken that time out and worked. And that's a great source of inspiration. But what I remember in the years that I used to notice him on one of those wooden desks is that he wouldn't budge from there. He would be reading. Unlike most of us who would have had several cups of tea, had chatted with our pals, complained about various things, come back for a little while, Sumit would be there without moving, working. And again, it's something that I have rarely seen, and particularly I don't go to NMML at all these days, and haven't been there for a while now.
But I haven't seen that amongst most other academics or younger scholars and so on. And it is an image that will stay with me. And the final image that I want to share here is a very different kind of image of Sumit had a very mischievous sense of humor. And he would laugh a lot, and he could chuckle quite immoderately, I would say, at various things, stupid things that you might have done, and I'll share one of them. In the early 1990s, I spent 1 year in Delhi University's history department. I had a research associateship there, and I also taught a bit. The stories of that are quite funny and maybe should be reserved for another time. But I then was going to go to CDS, and I was very happy that I was leaving the history department. I wrote a very self-righteous letter and got it typed up and left one in the history department's office for the head of the department, and I ran off to Sumit to give him a copy of that letter because I had been complaining continuously to him about, they said this and they did that and so on and so forth. He looked at the letter and started laughing. And I was deeply hurt because I thought, oh my God, I had such a difficult time. Now I've written this letter and he's laughing. And he said, you've written Principal Bhatia. You haven't written Pritipal Bhatia. And I had written Principal Bhatia in the self-righteous letter. The top of it was, Dear Principal Bhatia, and I'd gone and left it for her. So, there were lots and lots of occasions in which I have had the privilege and great pleasure of sharing and learning and just listening to a profoundly serious historian and thinker talk aloud about his passions. It could be things that he had been reading, and so much of what many of us started reading, certainly in the 80s and early 90s, had to do with the kinds of excitement that Sumit had or Tonika had about the kinds of things that they were reading at that time. And certainly a lot of the popular cultural writing from Europe and so on, but also radical labor historians, E.P. Thompson, of course, and many, many others. So I want to share here a poem that was written for Howard Zinn. Some of you would know about Howard Zinn. He was a great historian of the people. He was known as the people's historian. American historian, labor historian, anti-racist historian, anti-war historian, and so on. And the great African-Americanist poet Kenneth Carroll wrote this poem for Howard Zinn in 2014. And where it says Zinn, you can replace that with Sumit. Who will come to tell us what we know? That the king's clothes are soiled with the history of our blood and sweat? Who memorializes us when we have been vanquished? Who recounts our moments of resistance, explicates our struggles, sings of our sacrifices to those unable to hear our song? Who speaks of our triumphs, of how we altered the course of a raging river of oppression, how we turned our love for each other into a garrison of righteous rebellion? Who shows us even in failure, when we have been less than large, when our own prejudices have been turned against us like stolen weapons? Who walks amongst us, willing to tell the truth about the monster of lies, an eclipse that casts a shadow dark enough to cover centuries? What manner of man, of woman, of truth-teller roots around the muck of history, the word covered in the mud of denial, the mythology of the conquerors? Let them be Zinn, and I would say, let them be Sumit. Let them sing to the people of history. Let their song come slowly on the periphery of canon of history departments owned by corporate prevaricators. Let their song be sung in small circles, furtive meetings, lonely readers, underground and under siege, their song, the seed crushed to earth and growing now a tree with fruit, multiplying truth. The second poem I want to read is for Tonika and also for all of us. It's by E.E. Cummings, the early 20th century modernist poet. It's called Love is Thicker Than Forget. Love is more thicker than forget, more thinner than recall, more seldom than a wave is wet, more frequent than to fail. It is most mad and moonly, and lest it shall unbe, than all the sea which only is deeper than the sea. Love is less always than to win, less never than alive, less bigger than the least begin, less littler than forgive. It is most sane and sunly, and more it cannot die than all the sky which only is higher than the sky. With so much love, Sumit. No goodbyes.
So I happened to be in Lucknow when Sumit died. I therefore wrote a brief letter to Tanika, and a couple of days later she called and said that she would like me to speak. I panicked that evening, but by the next morning I thought I'd like to do it. And I was wondering what I should say or what I should write, and I thought, well, let me just carry on with the letter that I was writing. So what I have before me is addressed to Tanika. Of course, Pochka and Anna are there, and now that it's going to be read out in front of all of you, it's addressed to all of us. So let me say what I have written. Dearest Tanika, Sumit was on my mind a lot since I saw him last, lying in bed at home, just before I left for Iceland around mid-April. I remember feeling happy that he could acknowledge my presence when you informed him that I was standing beside him. I thought of him almost every day while I was away. There were times during my wanderings when I imagined that he'd have loved to hear tales of my encounters with some people and places. There was, for instance, a place called Kiruna in Sweden's far north. Soon after taking a picture of an unusual sculpture on the platform of Kiruna railway station depicting workers carrying hardware for railroad construction, which I thought I'd show Sumit upon my return, I got talking to a man called Rolf. He was the bartender in the dining car of the train I was traveling on, but also doubled up as a teacher of history at the nearby University of Luleå. Rolf spoke endlessly about the everyday life of workers who had built the railway in this part of the country. Soon, other passengers, including a feminist priest, chipped in, and all I could do was to try to follow a conversation that swung between spontaneous tellings of histories from below and arguments in favor of transgressing nationalist frames in a fight for common futures. I'd hoped to be able to share these stories with Sumit. Regretfully, this never happened. So here I am reading some of them out to you and all of you instead. I never said this to either of you, I mean Sumit and Tanika, but I often thought of Sumit during my post-retirement antidepressant wanderings. Last year I was in Sofia. Chitra had told me about E.P. Thompson's older brother Frank Thompson, who'd been captured and killed near Sofia in 1944 while fighting with partisans in Bulgaria against the Axis powers. I couldn't make it to most places near Sofia named after Frank Thompson, but I did go to Major Thompson Street. Sumit was with me all along, and I was glad that I could pay tribute to the memory of both Frank and E.P. Thompson by walking this particular street and remembering them on Chitra's and Sumit's behalf as well. I did tell Sumit the story, but to my eternal regret, I was too embarrassed to tell him that I'd taken him along with me to a place very close to where Frank Thompson lies buried. Nor did I get down to telling him of how, completely unbeknownst to me, his ideas on the social history of art and aesthetics had seeped into my imagination, helping me marvel at the painted monasteries of Bukovina in Romania last year. I'd obviously come a long way from the early summer's afternoon in 2006, when I could barely comprehend Shahana's impatience to get into the Uffizi gallery in Firenze, while I was more than happy to hang around the streets and walk by the river Arno. She disappeared inside. At the end of a long wait, she emerged, beaming from year to year. "I am so glad I was Sumit's student," she gushed. I loved his classes on the social history of early modern Europe, but nothing prepared me for the surprise of realizing the magic until I entered the Uffizi and was able to see, feel, and understand what I might never have, but for the course he offered and the work and imagination he brought to bear upon its teaching. And so she went on and on, weaving in and out of Sumit's classes and the Uffizi, casting a stone in still waters in the process, the ripples from which, upon reaching me, would open up through Sumit via Shahana fascinating ways of seeing and understanding that would send me scuttling across Romania looking for painted monasteries almost 2 decades later. Come to think of it, Sumit Sarkar के छात्र न होने का मेरे लिए नतीजा ये रहा that no matter when and how I might have been introduced to his early historical writings, उनको पढ़ने, समझने और अपनी ज़िंदगी में उतारने का असली मज़ा ना तो एक झटके में मिला और ना ही तन्हाई में। मिलना शुरू हुआ तो सिर्फ औरों से बात करके, आपसी बहस मुबाहिसे के ज़रिए, ख़ास करके JNU में रवि वासुदेवन के साथ। पीपल आर पीपल थ्रू अदर पीपल आफ्टर ऑल। तो ये सिलसिला कभी ख़त्म नहीं हुआ। बावजूद इसके that once inspired by Sumit's writings, I kept seeking out whatever he wrote on my own as well, always amazed, among other things, by his unceasing capacity to bring his fine critical faculties to bear upon his own historical understanding. Whenever opportunity offered, of course, I enjoyed hearing him speak. His voice always reassuring as he sought to listen, to clear doubts and explain matters at hand as best as could be done at a particular moment. I am reminded of a meeting held at JNU in the early 2000s at which Neil and Sumit spoke of the need to keep alive the ICHR's Toward Freedom project. There was no heckling, but many questions were posed. Each of the questions was taken seriously and matters explained at length by both Neil and Sumit. That night we saw two historians at work at a public meeting in the finest traditions of the teaching of history. It was a pleasure and remains memorable. It's true that this moment was splendid, but it was far from being singular. As the years passed since the time I was first touched by Sumit's writings, they came to mean more and more to me, his older works as much as what he continued writing. One of the reasons for this was no less remarkable for being very simple. Sumit Sarkar seemed to flow with ease out of his treasured world of archives and books into public meetings, seminars, DUTA or departmental GVMs, onto the streets and back again with unceasing consistency. It was as if his learning, erudition, aesthetic sensibility and a professorship at the University of Delhi kept demanding critical public engagement of him, as well as regular participation in collective acts of resistance and protest aimed at fighting for teachers' rights, strengthening progressive unionism, encouraging the participation of all teachers in the remaking of syllabi for the Department of History, deepening secularism and democracy on campus and beyond, and always, without fail, he willingly surrendered. Demonstrations, strikes, public meetings, and protest gatherings never seemed extraneous to his being or a waste of his time. To the contrary, they appeared to be woven into and born of the texture of his humaneness, romantic temperament, wit, deep understanding of historical materialism, and well-grounded political convictions. Professorship neither dimmed Sumit's resilient rebelliousness against power and spectacle, nor his thirst for the feelings of camaraderie and solidarity, the bursts of hope and creativity that accompany active participation in democratically inspired meetings or mass protests, stretching out, greeting the day like the music from Louis Armstrong's trumpet. Sumit remained true to scholarship and to his profession, warm, gentle, kind, and true to people, true to the deeds that sprang from his words and the ideas that were cradled by his deeds, and true to what I imagined to have been a special place he harbored in his mind and heart for the Department of History, Ramjas. No wonder he could feel at home in libraries and inside classrooms, but equally at meetings held at Ramjas, for instance, against fascism, militarization and the nuclear bomb, or in defense of history, or against the killings of Muslims in Gujarat and of peasants at Nandigram, at an AILH conference on labor, as much as at anti-communal protest gatherings that were organized every December 6th by students and teachers at the Vivekanand statue, University of Delhi. It was, it seemed, clear to Sumit that Delhi University, like all other universities, embedded in social relations of fluid tension and cooperation between and among students, teachers, non-teaching staff in the state, could maintain the integrity of their being only so long as the thirst for knowledge, combined with struggles from below for the rights to justice, participatory democracy and universal freedoms. The body blows delivered the academic and democratic life of DU, beginning with the imposition of semesterization, followed by ideologically driven physical assaults at JNU, Ramjas and Jamia in 2016, 17, 19, and the recent mass purge of teachers at Delhi University, accompanied by largely Hindutva-fueled occupation of faculty positions, bothered Sumit no end. He remained concerned for long-serving ad hoc teachers suddenly shown the door, and saddened and bewildered by their de facto abandonment by most colleagues and teachers' organizations, not to speak of the Duta, during one of the worst crises in employment relations ever faced by Delhi University. The jump in the number of guest teachers during the past year, the worsening conditions of employment for non-teaching staff, and the poverty of intellectual life and precarious futures staring students and all employees in the face troubled him hugely. Yet, speaking with him or listening to him speak about this or any other dire reality for that matter, never came with a sense that we'd reached the end of the road. A sentence here or a comment there, thrown in seemingly nonchalantly, were enough to allow me to leave with a spring in my step and A.K. Ramanujan on my lips. कहानी को दीवान में बंद तो किया जा सकता है, लेकिन ऐसा करने से किसी भी कहानी का कभी अंत नहीं हो जाता. Is it any wonder then that the more I saw of Sumit after my first encounter with him on December 6, 1984, when he was sitting on the selection committee at Ramjas where I was an interviewee, the more I returned to his writings, or that the more his scholarship and ways of being seeped into my own ways of thinking and seeing, a time came when I began to remember him during my travels. The professor, in his simple bush shirt and casual trousers, sandals on his feet and a leather bag slung on his shoulder, who shocked the hell out of a young Ramjas student from Majuli in the late 90s by boarding DTC bus number 100 at North Campus and sitting next to him as any passenger might, but then put him at ease further down the road by beginning to ask him about life in Majuli instead of about history, is no more. Tanika, Bhojka और Anna तो उनकी जान थे, और Sumit आपकी. I can barely begin to imagine what this loss must feel to you. But I also know that even when we have to let go of those who truly matter, they remain with us forever. Some, like Sumit, for driving us to reach for the stars in our common sky, with feet firmly planted on ground that must belong to all. Take care, dearest Tanika, Bhojka, Anna और आपको मेरा प्यार.
Like Anu, I'm also afraid of falling down. I'd like to start by just thanking everyone who's spoken. I know I don't speak just for myself, but also for my mother and for Anna as well, when I say how deeply moved we are by all the tributes and all the insights as well that we've heard. It's very hard to speak today. It's difficult to figure out what to say, how to say it. It's impossible to strike the right balance between private grief and public tribute. I think I know what I would have wanted to say if I could. I would have liked to talk at length about my relationship with my father, or as I always knew him, just Sumit. to illuminate the person he was, to narrate anecdote after anecdote, some of them joyful, some of them hilarious, some of them sad, in order to demonstrate how much he meant, how much he means to me. But it's too soon. It's too soon to do this in public, and it may always be too soon. So I'm going to do something different to mark Sumit's passing in this public forum. I've chosen to bring together two apparently distant aspects of his life, which in reality are not so distant at all: his politics and his literary sensibilities and tastes, both of which I hope have left permanent traces in me. I'm going to do this by reading, in a while, you'll have to wait for it a bit, but by reading 5 poems by authors, by poets who were dear both to him and to me, and whose work we shared and discussed many times over the years. And I'll intersperse my reading of these poems with some remarks about what they mean or what they might have meant to him and what they might say about him. Now, I'm very aware that this is a reductive and inadequate way of talking about Sumit. It would be an inadequate way of talking about anybody. The things I'm going to say will not reflect Sumit as the whole person he was. But if I tried to do that, I either would not be able to go on because of the weight of it all, or I wouldn't be able to stop. So what I'll say now is all I can bring myself to say now. So politics first, always. The political tradition and experience that was dearest to Sumit and has been acknowledged as dearest to him was, of course, Marxism. He was, in a complex way, a lifelong Marxist. It lay at the core of his commitments, at the core of his sensibilities. But Marxism for him was never a single thing. It was also never a simple thing. He was always emphatic in his refusal of any description of Marxism as a science. Yeah, he had an almost aesthetic revulsion against that kind of description. And he was uneasy and skeptical also in thinking of it as a method. He would have considered these boxes into which this thing he loved so much, Marxism, was being shoehorned. He saw it rather as a many-sided, open-ended intellectual adventure, a commitment to social justice and compassion, and, as Rajiv so beautifully put it, a non-instrumental idea of sociabilities, and a complex, inspiring, but deeply tragic political history to reflect on, learn from, and criticize. Now, as I say this, I can imagine, what if Sumit was here right now, he'd be sort of smiling, but also looking rather quizzical, and he'd sort of in a twinkling way say, okay, those are nice words, but aren't those also boxes? Yeah, of course they are. From a precociously early age, I was introduced by both my parents to the richness, the plurality, the inner tensions of the 20th century Marxist tradition. And many of you have spoken very eloquently about how this was embodied in his work. His emotional attachment to this tradition lasted it outlasted his terrible accident in 2007, which slowly and painfully depleted him of so many of his capacities. Almost till the end of his life, he would speak passionately about the memory of this workers' struggle, this piece of communist poetry, or that rousing revolutionary slogan or song. In his declining years, Anna would very lovingly play him Paul Robeson's rendition of the great American labor movement song, Joe Hill. Or he'd listen to songs from the Spanish Civil War, and tears would come into his eyes. Tears not of sorrow, but of joy and even pride at inhabiting this great and, if deeply ambiguous, political tradition. Of course, it wasn't just tears. There was also his twinkling humor. When he responded to artifacts of left culture, he loved a line from a song from an ironical song by the comedian Tom Lehrer, which I'll just quote here. Remember the war against Franco. It's the kind where each of us belong. Though he may have won all the battles, we had all the good songs. I can't imagine a halfway honest leftist who doesn't have similarly ironical thoughts at least 5 times a day. Now, all these in different ways were marks of belonging to a common tradition, which he certainly thought of as a Marxist tradition. But this was not all. There was another side to this. In my early teens, he also introduced me absolutely unflinchingly to the other, darker side of the tradition he continued to cherish. And he talked to me of the doubts, very often and very openly, of the doubts and hesitations that attended his Marxism. After all, he had become a young communist following in his own father's footsteps at a time when uncritical adulation of the Soviet Union was universal, more or less, on the Indian left and across much of the Indian left, when being a Marxist more or less meant necessarily being a Stalinist. His world, the security of this world was rocked forever by the revelations made by Khrushchev in 1956, which made such a deep impression upon Sumit as a 17-year-old. He talked of it often. Later in life, he would acknowledge that these revelations, searing as they were, did not even graze the surface of the innumerable crimes of the state socialism of the 20th century. The harvest of corpses sacrificed upon its altar, the indescribable cruelties perpetuated in his name. He very strongly encouraged me to read George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, an indictment of Stalinism, which he also considered the greatest work on the Spanish Civil War. And even more urgently, he pressed me to read Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, which he considered perhaps the definitive novel on the Soviet 1930s. At the same time, he spoke generously and enthusiastically many times over the decades about the cultures of radical politics that could loosely be described as the New Left. E.P. Thompson, as everyone who has read Sumit will know, embodied for him the very best of what he thought of as the socialist tradition. Until almost the end of his days, he spoke of the extraordinary excitement he felt, again, as a young man during the Prague Spring of 1968. And to quote him verbatim, he often described this as really the last chance that socialism had. And he spoke of his bitterness about the brutal way in which it was crushed. Indeed, I'm very certain that all of this very deeply shaped Sumit's intellectual trajectory. Much is often said about his departure from subaltern studies and the reasons for it, and I don't in any way want to diminish the significance of this. It grounded his shift away from political histories in the received sense and towards the richly textured social histories that he developed in his later work, above all in writing social history, which I think he considered his finest work. But at least as significant, and to my mind at least rather more, were the impulses that led him to subaltern studies in the first place, and away from orthodox and doctrinaire declensions of Marxism. We often tend to think of this in purely academic and intellectual terms, as though it was simply an intellectual opposition to reductive frameworks that drove this sort of plural, open-ended Marxism. But I strongly believe that the inner moral and political tensions of the Marxist tradition in its entirety, as he experienced them and as I've just tried to describe his sense of them, were really the key factor. His journey as a Marxist was, I think, inseparable from his growing distance from the traditions of state socialism, which, whether we like it or not, constituted the dominant and most influential version of Marxism by far through the 20th century. But I'm not going to belabor this here. The point I'm getting at is that Sumit could hold these tensions in balance. He could affirm the grandeur, the heroism, the sacrifices, the achievements that define so much of the history of Marxism, while ceaselessly thinking about the immense darkness that shadowed it. Equally, he could acknowledge all the horrors without ever abandoning the tradition itself. In all honesty, this is an enormously difficult balance to strike, and it says something about him that he was able to do so without ever diminishing either one side or the other, without relapsing into convenient or consolatory answers to these truly terrible, terrible questions. I confess that insofar as I bear any part of his intellectual and moral inheritance, I find it hard, even impossible, to maintain this balance. For me, the revulsions and hesitations often overwhelm the affirmation, and the anti-Stalinism I learned from Sumit and later developed further on my own often outweighs whatever Marxism I have, though I perhaps still have some. Be that as it may, right now it is Sumit as a Marxist the believer in radical egalitarianism, in subaltern social struggles, the critic of class power, of oppression and exploitation, whom I wish to remember in public. To this end, the first 3 poems I have chosen are by a poet whom we both love deeply, Bertolt Brecht, arguably the greatest communist poet of the 20th century. I begin with a poem that Sumit often used in his classes. I've been told this often by his former students. It's also, thanks to Sumit, the very first poem I have a conscious memory of reading and actually thinking about. I have no idea how old I was when I heard it, but old enough to grasp some of it, I think. I remember it was in Calcutta. It was this already rather faded bilingual translation of Brecht, which I'm sure lots of people in the audience also possess copies of this book. Brecht, A Worker Reads History. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with names of kings. Was it the kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? And Babylon, so many times destroyed. Who built the city up each time? In which of Lima's houses, that city glittering with gold, lived those who built it? In the evening when the Chinese wall was finished, where did the masons go? Imperial Rome is full of arcs of triumph. Who reared them up? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Byzantium lives in song. Were all her dwellings palaces? And even in Atlantis of the legend, the night the seas rushed in, the drowning men still bellowed for their slaves. Young Alexander conquered India. He alone? Caesar beat the Gauls. Was there not even a cook in his army? Philip of Spain wept as his fleet was sunk and destroyed. Were there no other tears? Frederick the Great triumphed in the 7 Years' War. Who triumphed with him? Each page a victory. At whose expense the victory ball? Every 10 years, a great man. Who paid the piper? So many particulars, so many questions. I was determined not to say very much about Sumit as a historian. Others who have spoken today have done so much more articulately than I feel able to. But I will say that those last 2 sentences, so many particulars, so many questions, to my mind very amply sum up his practice as a historian. And it also just struck me, every 10 years a great man who paid the piper. I mean, what better way of looking at our country today? I'm tempted here to share an ironical and darkly amusing anecdote from my own experience as a teacher of history. Many years ago, I taught courses on labor history when I was a postdoc in Germany. And one of the very first times I did a class on workers' movements, I thought I'd quite consciously channel Sumit, and I'd used this poem. And so I very enthusiastically circulated it among my students. But as luck would have it, the only articulate and confident student in class that day, the only one willing to express his opinions loudly, was a passionate admirer of Mussolini. So let's just say that early experience of using a great revolutionary poem in class didn't exactly go according to plan. Much more seriously, the memory of this poem, which Sumit so loved, is linked in my mind to something that has happened very recently. A grassroots educational initiative based in Kolkata, a school for working class children in Bastis, has joined hands with a group that publishes history books for children, Itihasher Hatikori. They have instituted this amazing project that will enable working class teenagers to research and explore their own local histories. And they have named this project after Sumit. He was no respecter of persons, including himself. He hated veneration, but at the same time, nothing could have made him happier than this, and nothing could be a better tribute than this. Anyway, let me turn to the second Brecht poem that I want to read, which I think speaks for itself, although I will say something about it. A Bed for the Night. I hear that in New York, at the corner of 26th Street and Broadway, a man stands every evening during the winter months and gets beds for the homeless there by appealing to passers-by. It won't change the world. It won't improve relations among men. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. But a few men have a bed for the night. For a night, the wind is kept from them. The snow meant for them falls on the roadway. Don't put down the book on reading this man. A few people have a bed for the night. For a night, the wind is kept from them. The snow meant for them falls on the roadway. But it won't change the world. It won't improve relations among men. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. In Sumit's declining years, I'd read this poem to him often, and although his memory and his capacity to absorb were on the wane, we still managed to discuss it on quite a few occasions. And I have a hazy memory of him commenting with great pleasure on the dialectical reversal in the last passage. You know, I mean, the second stanza ends with that kind of consolation. The snow meant for them falls on the roadway, which is, of course, very beautiful. But then, you know, it reverses, it flips it around completely. It will not shorten the age of exploitation. And I remember us discussing the fact that if the order of stanzas was reversed, you know, if the middle part came at the end and the end part in the middle, it would remain just as great a poem, but it would be a different sensibility. It would be contrary to Brecht's sensibilities. Now, the third and final Brecht poem that I want to place before you is not actually one that Sumit and I discussed. I don't even know if he read it. He must have. He read everything. It's a tiny poem, but it illuminates something else about Sumit's politics. Something much more unambiguous, much less internally fraught than his Marxism, something where there was no doubt, no hesitation, only unflinching certitude and unflinching courage and commitment. And I refer, of course, to the anti-fascism in the very fullest sense of the word that preoccupied him most from the 1990s onwards. So in order to contextualize this poem for Sumit, I need to tell a slightly complicated and painful story. He suffered a medical collapse in April this year, and he was hospitalized. And he returned home after 3 weeks in the ICU. But he was no longer capable of extended conversation or engagement. However much Anna and my mother and I tried to hope against hope, it was clear that he didn't have very long left. And during this period, I remember reflecting many times with immense sorrow and anger, and above all with immense bitterness on one thing among others, that he was dying in this political climate, in this horrible political climate which seemed so utterly barren, so utterly devoid of any hope, any dignity, anything human, anything but utter ugliness and cruelty wherever you look in most parts of the world, but especially here. In July, he entered his final cycle, and I'm not going to impose the burden of describing that upon your ears. But while the experience was shattering for us, the external context was now radically different. And I'm referring, of course, to the CJP movement, to the extraordinary, brave, witty, irreverent, youthful movement that spread outwards from central Delhi, perplexed those who sought and seek to crush it, and took the country by storm. Sumit by then was back in the ICU in no state to speak, perhaps in no state to actually absorb anything or even think. We have no way of knowing what kind of consciousness he still had. The doctors couldn't tell us. But when I stood by his bed in the ICU, every day I'd tell him about this beautiful and stunning carnival of democracy unfolding before our eyes in the face of such desperate odds. Sometimes he twitched his face. I don't know if it was conscious, but I'd like to think that it was a conscious gesture. Now that movement, of course, continues in the face of heavy odds. It also suffers ferocious pushback, slander, repression. But at the same time, there are cracks which are visible in a way that one had never thought before. And the forces of oppression, to use a euphemism, have looked worried and strained in a way wholly unfamiliar both to them and to us, whether one thinks of certain rather comical, unintentionally comical Instagram reels, or whether one thinks of, the purge of the social media dictatorship that was, So to this end, I'm going to read the third and the last of the Brecht poems I selected. The last line for me says it all, so pay particular attention to the last line. Had Sumit been here still, he would have so loved this movement, so hated the forces deployed against it, had such contempt for the methods that have been used to sort of slander it and repress it. And he would so intensely have responded to the last bit of this poem. It's called The Mask of Evil. On my wall hangs a Japanese carving, the mask of an evil demon, decorated with gold lacquer. Sympathetically, I observe the swollen veins on the forehead, indicating what a strain it is to be evil. So, no comment needed, I think. I don't want to give anybody, however, the impression that Sumit's love of poetry, or indeed of art, aesthetics, beauty, was in any sense confined by his left-wing politics. So by way of conclusion, I want to turn to two great modern poets who could not be more different from Brecht. Indeed, both were very emphatically poets from the right of the political spectrum, but who were every bit as dear to him as any socialist poet was, actually more. The two poets I refer to are the great modernists T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats. And I'll begin with not a whole poem, but a passage from an Eliot poem that Sumit very greatly loved, the early piece Gerontion. And this too, I think, he may have spoken about in class. So here we go from Gerontion. Think now. History has many cunning passages, contrived corridors and issues, deceives with whispering ambitions, guides us by vanities. Think now. She gives when our attention is distracted, and what she gives with such supple confusions that the giving famishes the craving. Gives too late what's not believed in or is still believed, in memory only, reconsidered passion. Gives too soon into weak hands what's thought can be dispensed with till the refusal propagates a fear. Think, neither fear nor courage saves us. Unnatural vices are fathered by our heroism. Virtues are forced upon us by our impudent crimes. These tears are shaken from the wrath-bearing tree. I don't recall how old I was when he first read this passage to me, but I do know it was deeply intertwined with Sumit's sense of what history is, its twists and turns, its reversals, its unintended consequences, its endless irony. Indeed, when I think of the phrase unnatural vices are fathered by our heroism, I think that these lines corresponded deeply to Sumit's sense of dialectics and even to his sense of the history of socialism. Anyway, I've probably gone on more than long enough, so I'd just like to conclude with a poem by Yeats. Yeats, in a sense, has been a poet for 3 generations of the family. Sumit's father was a contemporary of Yeats and read him and loved him and passed that love on to Sumit. And from the other side of my family, my grandparents and then my mother were also lovers of Yeats. So I suppose I had no choice. Unlike all the other poems I've read, it's got nothing really to do with politics. Which is probably appropriate because, while this has been about politics, Sumit's life was not exhausted by politics. This poem's a meditation on what it means to be at peace, I suppose. It's not a poem about death, it's a poem about peace. But of course, we'll read it through our own prisms today. I can't quite explain why I think it's appropriate to end with it, at least not without plunging into a long and convoluted discourse, but I do think it's appropriate. So I'll just read it and stop there. It's called the Lake Isle of Innisfree, a small island in Ireland. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin built there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow. and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always night and day. I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core. Thank you.